I'm Ethan Walker, and this story has stuck with me since it happened back when I was in high school. It was my junior year at Ridgewood High, a pretty normal suburban school just outside of Chicago. That day started like any other, but I'd never have guessed how it would end. It was third period, English class. Mrs. Cunningham had us working in groups on a poetry project, but honestly, none of us were really focused. I was at a table with my best friend Brian and a girl named Natalie, who I barely knew. We were laughing about some dumb meme Brian had shown me when the intercom crackled to life. Attention staff and students, we are now in a lockdown. This is not a drill. The voice was calm, but something about the way it was said felt off. The laughter in the room stopped immediately. Mrs. Cunningham froze for a split second, then sprang into action. She locked the door, turned off the lights, and motioned for us to gather in the corner of the room, away from the windows. That's when the reality of the situation hit me. This wasn't just another drill. We all crouched there in the dark, trying not to make a sound. Someone's phone buzzed, and Mrs. Cunningham gave them a sharp look, putting her finger to her lips. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I was afraid it might give us away. About 10 minutes passed in silence, and then we heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I glanced at Brian, who was staring at the door with wide eyes. Natalie was gripping the sleeve of my hoodie so tightly it was cutting off circulation. Mrs. Cunningham motioned for us to stay absolutely still. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. The handle rattled softly, almost experimentally, then harder, like someone was testing how secure it was. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be here. I could barely breathe as I watched the shadow of their feet under the doorframe. They just stood there for what felt like forever. And then they started whispering. It wasn't loud enough to make out the words, but it sent chills down my spine. It wasn't Mrs. Cunningham. It wasn't a student. I couldn't tell if they were talking to themselves or someone else. And then, just as suddenly as they'd come, the shadow disappeared. We stayed huddled there for what must have been an hour, though it felt like an eternity. The only sound was the occasional creak of the building and the muffled breathing of 25 terrified teenagers. Eventually, we heard voices in the hallway, familiar ones. The principal's voice, followed by a police officer's. "This is the police. The building is secure. Staff, please check your students and prepare for evacuation." Mrs. Cunningham let out a shaky breath, and I realized I'd been holding mine too. She opened the door just enough to confirm it was safe before ushering us out into the hallway. That's when we saw it. Down at the far end of the hall, near the emergency exit, a backpack was lying open on the floor. Papers were scattered everywhere, and next to it was a knife. We later found out that a man had walked onto campus through an unlocked side door. No one knew who he was or what he wanted. He wasn't a parent or anyone from the town. Security cameras caught him wandering the halls, trying door handles, but he left before the police arrived. Nothing happened to us that day, but the fear? That stayed. Even now, years later, I can't walk into a school without feeling that tightness in my chest. Because that day, I realized how vulnerable we all are, even in places we think are safe. I've always thought that school was a safe place. You go there to learn, hang out with friends, maybe even get bored out of your mind in classes like algebra or history. It's just school. Nothing bad happens there. At least, that's what I believed until last March. My name's Ethan, and I'm a senior at Crestwood High in Ohio. The day it happened, everything started so normal. It was third period, English class, and Mrs. Callahan was droning on about the Great Gatsby. She had this way of reading aloud that was almost hypnotic. You know, the kind of tone that makes your eyelids feel heavy? I was sitting by the window, staring out at the empty football field. The spring sunlight was pouring in, and all I could think about was getting out of school and heading to practice later. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, and I was counting down the minutes until the bell. Then the intercom crackled. "Students and staff, this is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Secure your rooms immediately. This is not a drill." The voice belonged to Mr. Lancer, the assistant principal. Normally, he's this laid-back guy who jokes around during assemblies, but his voice, it wasn't right. It was shaky, like he was struggling to stay calm. For a second, nobody moved. It was like we were all waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a mistake. But Mrs. Callahan didn't laugh. She dropped her book, her face turning pale as she rushed to lock the door. "Everyone, to the back of the room. Now!" she said, her voice trembling. We scrambled to the corner, cramming ourselves between the bookshelves and the supply cabinets. Someone knocked over a chair and the clatter made me jump. The blinds were pulled down and Mrs. Callahan killed the lights. In the dark, you could hear everything, our breathing, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the faint creak of the building settling. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. At first, I thought it was just another drill. They'd send an email later explaining it was some kind of mix-up and we'd laugh about it during lunch. But then we heard it. Footsteps. They echoed down the hall, slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They weren't running. They weren't panicked. They were calm. I looked at Tyler, my best friend, sitting next to me. His face was pale and his fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. I wanted to ask him if he thought it was a teacher checking doors, but I couldn't make my mouth work. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside our door. We all froze. I swear I don't think anyone even breathed. The doorknob rattled once, softly, then again, harder this time. Whoever it was tried turning it, jiggling it like they thought the lock might give. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give us away. Mrs. Callahan put her finger to her lips, her wide eyes darting between us and the door. And then, nothing. The footsteps moved on, fading down the hallway. I felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. A loud bang echoed through the hall, followed by a scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was raw, panicked, like someone was begging for help. My stomach turned. Tyler whispered, "What the hell is going on?" Mrs. Callahan shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands were shaking so bad she had to grip the edge of the bookshelf to steady herself. Another bang, then another. It sounded like doors being forced open. Each one made me flinch. We sat there, huddled together, for what felt like hours. Every little sound made my skin crawl, the hum of the intercom, the creak of the floorboards, even the muffled sniffles of the girl next to me. And then, the worst sound of all, silence. It stretched on for so long I started to wonder if it was over. Maybe the cops had come, or maybe whoever it was had left. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Suddenly there was a loud crash, the sound of glass shattering. It was close, too close. Mrs. Callahan grabbed her phone and started dialing. I could see her hands trembling as she whispered into the receiver, "Yes, we're in room 213. Please hurry. We don't know where they are." The rest of us stayed silent, clinging to each other, waiting for something, anything to happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard voices in the hallway. Not the slow, deliberate footsteps from earlier, but quick, purposeful steps. The kind that belonged to someone in charge. "This is the police. Stay where you are." Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. When the officers opened the door, their faces were tense, their hands on their weapons. They told us to follow them quickly and stay low. As we walked through the hallway, I saw the aftermath. Doors were splintered, papers were scattered everywhere, and the glass in one of the fire alarms was smashed. We later found out that a man had entered the school through an unlocked maintenance door. He wasn't armed, but he had been trying to force his way into classrooms. No one knows why he was there or what he wanted. What sticks with me the most, though, is how quiet it was during the lockdown. No sirens, no chaos, just the sound of footsteps and silence. I don't take those drills lightly anymore. And every time I hear someone knock on a door, I freeze, just for a second, waiting to see if it's a sound I recognize.